Hello everyone, welcome to my channel about writing stuff. My name's Camille and today we're talking about idea extrapolation. Yes, I'm recording multiple vlogs in a row, so I look exactly the same and I'm in exactly the same place, but whatever. So, I've done world building videos in the past. Specifically, I did a world building video about baseline. So I have multiple processes for creating worlds, and the one that I'm most comfortable with is the baseline idea, which is I kind of do some research and find a place in history where the technology, travel, science, all of that kind of coincides with the feel that I want, just so that I have a jumping off point. But there's another way I world build as well, which is taking one single idea and extrapolating it into a setting with conflict and contention, which is what we'll talk about in a minute. But, the baseline theory is you don't have a whole lot of wiggle room, but it's a great place to start. I'll link that video up above. But basically, how to create a world or a setting starting with one idea. So, my current work in progress, this single idea was the magic. I wanted to create a magic surrounding this idea of oil drilling. So, that's a common conversation in modern times. We use, crude oil to make petroleum and all that kind of stuff and fuel that people need. But I didn't want my fantasy world, the secondary fantasy world, to be modern. I wanted it to be more of 1700s, 1800s London. But even then, they didn't really drill for oil yet. So I was like, well, I'll just make it part of the magic, and therefore there is a reason. So that's the big thing. You have this idea, maybe it's magic, or maybe it's something innocuous, like the currency or the trade market, or just like a feeling. Maybe you want the setting to be dark and smoldering or bright and happy or whatever. And you have to make that make sense. So if you have a setting that's dark and smoldering, well, why? Are there factories? Is it an industrial setting? Are there fires that kind of happen a lot? Maybe it's a climate thing where the grass is always dry and just even the smallest spark or flame can just kind of tear through this setting. Or if you want a setting that's bright and sunny with meadows and just beautiful scenery, maybe it's a tropical place with not a lot of storms. Maybe it's a place with vast agriculture. Maybe there is no industry set up there yet to kind of darken the atmosphere. But that's the first tip, is you have this idea or this, basic premise or this kind of picture in your head of what you want to look like. So the first thing is you have to make it make sense. So I wanted to make a magic that has to do with oil drilling. So, or I wanted to have like oil drilling as part of this setting, but I didn't want it to be modern. So make the oil part of the magic, and therefore the industry surrounding that is far further along than the rest of industry in modern society. So make it make sense, make it have a reason. So with that, I was thinking, okay, well, what kind of setting would I need? Where in the world do people actually drill? And a lot of it was, well, there's sand drilling, there's ocean drilling, and this is, where the research comes in. You'll have to do research. If you want like this sort of dark, gloomy setting, you might have to do research on, what did industry look like? Factories, textile mills or what have you, and kind of see the steps that led to this sort of thing, and then interject your own narrative there. So, for instance, I did research on oil drilling, and it was this idea of Well, there's kind of some history surrounding it where, there's this idea that in like ancient Egypt, people and like ancient China, people were taking like really sharp rocks or gems and attaching it to bamboo sticks and essentially like driving into the ground to kind of find oil. Um, there's some ideas that they were using it to like light kerosene lamps and this kind of thing, even though I don't think there's actual proof. But that could correlate to this fantasy world where there isn't that much technology yet. So make it make sense, and then do research, see the steps that kind of took place to get to where we are today, and then interject your own fantasy. So I also did research on crude oil. Where does crude oil come from? And crude oil is the dark sludgy stuff that actually comes out of the ground before it's manufactured and refined into like petroleum or kerosene. But the research I did on crude oil explained that it came from, thousands and thousands of year-old animals that were essentially like crushed beneath the weight of the world and heated from the internal temperature of the earth to make this sort of sludge. So I was like, well, that's a great place I can inject mythology and religion. So from that seed came this idea of, well, there were these creatures that the gods defeated and they crushed them beneath the weight of the world, and thousands of years later we have crude oil. So not only is this oil part of the magic, but it also comes from these dark creatures that the gods defeated. So there is, in that, religious conflict and tension between the magic and the religion in the world. And those are the things you want to highlight. So that's my next point, is you're extrapolating this one idea and you go from, for instance, magic to history to religion. And those places where these things intersect and cause conflict is what you want to highlight, because that's where your plot comes from. If you have a utopia, there's really no story because everyone's happy and everything's bright and shiny. You want those places of conflict because that's where the story is. So even with that small idea, I don't, even have necessarily a character yet, but let's say I just stop at that point and say, let's make a plot out of this. I could say that there is this force of people who want to use the magic, and then this force of religious people who want to outlaw the magic because it's sacrilegious or against their gods, or just in a way dark and against the religious people's sensibilities. There could be a plot there because there's conflict, there's strife, there could be a rebellion brewing or a war brewing. There could be this plot of theft, of people trying to steal the oil from the religious people who are trying to hoard it and keep it from being used, etc. But let's take it a step further. So I had the one idea, the oil, the magic. I don't know what the magic is yet, but I do know the history. And I do know kind of the religion surrounding where this oil came from. So at this point, I did some more research because I wanted to figure out, how the magic works. So I did research of, what is crude oil actually made up of? And I found that there are trace metals. And of course, there are trace metals in the human body. And I thought, well, maybe the people in this world don't necessarily know how the magic works, only that it does. But as an author, you have to know. So I was thinking, well, the magic could be related to metals. And then that inferred more of my mythology and religion. So there are trace metals in the human body. There are trace metals in crude oil. Maybe the trace metals in the human body are kind of like the gods. It's holy, it's how they're born, whatever. And then the trace metals in the crude oil, which the crude oil was made from these dark creatures that the gods kind of crushed beneath the weight of the earth. The metals in crude oil could be like the demons or what have you, the sort of dark force. And then you have people in the world who can manipulate the metals in the human body, and then you have people in the world who can manipulate the metals in crude oil, hence conflict. So now I have this magic with two opposing forces. I have people who can manipulate the holy trace metals, and then people who can manipulate the dark trace metals. And this is all example stuff. I'm talking on the basis of the world that I'm currently working on. But this is the process. Is you have one idea and you have to make it make sense. How does it fit in this world? You can't have this type of world and then also have, airplanes, right? It just, and if you do want to have airplanes, you have to make it make sense. Maybe the airplanes run on this magic from this oil or whatever. But yeah, so this is kind of an off-the-cuff video. So I'm kind of like going back and forth. But basically, once you're at this point, you are pulling things down to make sense. You're making these cool, awesome things make sense. You are adding in places of conflict. You're doing research to sort of invent your own history or religion or myths or whatever. But then there are other things you need to think about for society to work. What does the economy look like? Is it normal historically where people exchange metals? Well, that won't work in my world because metals are used in the magic. So maybe this is a society where metals are extremely rare, which infers the architecture. I can't have homes made out of like steel. I can't have cast iron fixtures on the windows or the lampposts. So therefore, all the buildings would need to be made out of clay or brick or wood or whatever, which means, or that infers the landscape. If a lot of these homes are made out of wood, then I'll need forests surrounding this city of wood for building. So then that brings us back to, well, if metals are rare, what do they use for currency? Do they trade in goods? Do they have paper? What does the currency look like? And then that can infer, what market looks like. How does society interact? And then that brings about the question of what are the social constructs? What do manners look like? What does the class system look like? Etc. And it's really, when you're extrapolating from this one idea, it's really going in a line. So if you followed my thought process before, it's, I have the magic about metals. So metals have to be rare. So buildings have to be made out of this, which means that there has to be this in the landscape to make this work. And that's what it's about. It's about following your own train of thought, making things make sense, and then answering these questions, saying, well, if there isn't this, what needs to be in its place? If there is no metal, then what do we use to make homes? Well, wood. Okay, so then we need forest. Blah, 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 blah. But yeah, like I said, super off the cuff video, but that's pretty much how it works. It's a lot of questions. It's a lot of following your own leads and doing research and being creative. That's the main thing, is when you're creating a world, you do research to get ideas and sort of see how things have worked in our history to infer how things work in the history of your world. But what it really comes down to is you're drawing from the wealth of your own imagination. There's only so much research you can do. So when you're at this turning point of, well, what do I do instead? Try and be as creative as possible. It's easy to do the things that we've seen before, but, for me, for instance, this world has very few metals. The metals are rare. You can't find like just an ore of iron kind of sitting. You can't like mine for it. So how do people, what's the currency? And I was thinking paper, but we've seen that before. So I was like, well, if there are few metals, maybe gems. Maybe there is a wealth of, or maybe there are a wealth of gemstones in the society. So they use gems as their currency. Maybe they are cut and stamped and what have you. And that's what it comes down to. trying to be as creative and unique as possible and to pull everything down so that it makes sense. And yeah, so if you have any questions about that, or if you're kind of stuck in your own world building, feel free to leave me a comment. If you have a video request, you can comment or tweet me at Camille A. Singer. Thank you for watching, and for now, you should be writing stuff.